welcome back to the Astroben podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great, Ben. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you back again. You're actually the only guest I've had back twice, which is a testament to you because I haven't had anyone back yet. And obviously we're now on episode 103, and you kindly gave me your time back in 2021. I believe it was episode 24. I still don't know what I'm doing, but I'm very, I've very much been enjoying the journey, speaking to the best people in the space industry. So let's dive straight in. We were due to speak yesterday, but we had to rearrange. But you had a very good reason for rescheduling. You had a chat with the NASA administrator. What was that about? Was that a Q&A? Was that a panel? Was that an X discussion? What was that about?
Oh, I try to interview Administrator Nelson at least every 6 months or so, just to sort of find out what he's thinking about the agency and asking him some pressing questions. And it just so happened, like about 2 hours after our interview, they were going to release an update on the Starliner spacecraft. So we talked about that as well. So it was good timing.
Yeah, so Starliner, I'd love to touch on because the date's been well, Crew 9 has been pushed back, I believe.
Yeah, to September 24th.
And you're obviously quite prolific on X and other things. And it seems like you had a bit of an inkling. I'm not sure if you can talk about that. But is that because you knew something that we didn't as the public? Or how did you sort of get an inkling that that was going to be rescheduled? Was the reasons behind public? Yeah, what can you say to that? What happened and how did you get a heads up if you did?
I knew people who knew what was going on, and what was happening behind the scenes was quite different than the public narrative. So about a week ago, I reported that NASA had been working quietly for weeks with SpaceX to come back, have a backup plan for Starliner's crew to come back on Crew Dragon. So I put that out there, and then a few days ago, I had heard about the slip of Crew 9 to September 24th, and that one of the reasons was that the Starliner software package currently on the vehicle was incapable of autonomously undocked, and it was going to take some time to update and validate that software configuration. And so I wrote about that a couple of days ago. And that's just, we had not had a public press conference about Starliner in 13 days. And so I was just trying to get information out there that I thought was relevant to one of the most important human spaceflight stories in a couple of decades, I think. So it was just fortunately having some people who knew what was going on and they were willing to talk to me.
Yeah, and it's been a pretty hectic 24 hours because they've literally just announced that the Polaris Dawn mission is targeting August the 26th. We're recording this on August the 7th, so that means no earlier than August the 26th. It could be, I guess, a few days afterwards, depending on what the window is. Can you give us an update on the well, if you know any more than that, really? Obviously, the Polaris Dawn is definitely going to be a fun mission to cover and follow, and if it's anything like Inspiration 4 is going to be a popular one with the general public. What's your thoughts on that date? Are we good to launch, do you think, as much as we can say at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, technically everything's ready. The spacecraft is ready. The rocket is ready. The crew is ready. They were working to try to get something off on August 6th. And NASA basically said, we'd like you to stand down because we need to figure out what's going on with Starliner. We need to keep all of our options open. And so I think one of the benefits of pushing Crew 9 back to September 24th is that we now get to see the Polaris Dawn mission take off this month. And short of weather, some very last minute surprises, I think that date is a pretty good one.
And I've lucky enough to have spoken to Jared and all the crew for Polaris Dawn, and so I've talked at length with them and other guests about what's involved. But one part of it, which is particularly exciting, is the first commercial spacewalk. Obviously, you've got SpaceX suits, very sleek looking, and quite an exciting time. But what are you personally most excited about with the Polaris Dawn mission and the challenges and innovations involved in that mission? What are you looking forward to?
I'm just a big Ben. I'm a big space settlement guy, and I think that the only real reason ultimately to have humans involved in spaceflight is because we out as a species. I think we ought to be out there, living on other worlds, eventually around other stars, and the first steps toward that probably are a lunar base and eventually putting people on Mars. And what I like about Jared and his approach, and you've talked to him, I've talked to him, he's really committed to this idea that for humanity to have a future in space, it can't be led by the governments. Ultimately, it needs to be a commercial enterprise. And so, he with Polaris, or excuse me, with Inspiration 4, he had the first private orbital mission. And now with Polaris Dawn, he's flying the first commercial EVA, and with his funding, has helped push NASA toward develop a commercial spacesuit that ultimately could be used for many things. And this is obviously just version 1.0 of it. It'll be adapted in the future. But he's helping SpaceX and the commercial industry to push the boundaries further, and I think that's great.
Well, Jared's got he's got a very unique skill set where he falls into that billionaire category. So he's funding the mission himself and raising a huge amount of awareness for charity and for space exploration. But he's also going himself, which makes him a bit of a sort of outlier, really. Because to my knowledge, I don't think there's any other. Obviously, Branson has been to space, but there aren't any other billionaire space entrepreneurs that have physically gone themselves. Do you think we're going to see more of that as the space economy grows? Sort of billionaires choosing to put their funds towards the industry and then going themselves and sort of laying captaining the ship. It's like the early days of exploring the oceans. You fund the mission and then you go with them. Do you think we'll see more of that? Elon aside, obviously.
Obviously, Jeff Bezos went to space on New Shepard, and he's solely funding Blue Origin. So, beyond Jeff and Richard Branson, I'm not sure we'll see any other billionaires flying anytime soon. And in my mind, the goal really is to not have billionaires fly, but to have like plumbers fly and people who can mine asteroids and people who can, survive in relatively harsh conditions on the surface of the moon. I mean, I love the professional astronauts and they're the trailblazers, but if we're really going to make this work, you're going to need more regular people to go and to be able to do so safely. And so that's what I like about Jared's approach is he's really sort of pushing the boundaries in the sense of who is capable of spaceflight.
And of course, amateur podcasters and journalists will want to go as well.
We would love to go. Absolutely.
Well, you're not just a journalist, obviously. You're an author, and obviously a senior space editor at Ars Technica, which I hope I'm saying correct. I can't remember if I said that right last time.
Yep.
But it's great to have you back because one of the main reasons I wanted to chat again was you have a new book out, and the book called Reentry, SpaceX, Elon Musk, and the Reusable Rockets that launched a second space age. It's all my favorite words in one sentence, apart from Elon's name specifically. Although I am an Elon fan, but I'm not a super fan. But give us a brief overview of the book, because obviously SpaceX, no matter how you frame it, have done something that no other company has done. Where do we start? What's the periods that it covers, and why were you inspired to tell the story?
Yeah, so first of all, I would say it's okay to have complicated feelings about Elon. I certainly do, and struggled with that actually while writing Reentry, and go into some of my concerns about his behavior and its future impacts on SpaceX in the epilogue of the book. But basically, Reentry picks up from where liftoff ended, which was after the fourth flight of the Falcon 1 rocket, which was successful. And it really picks up with the development of the Falcon 9 rocket and the early struggles to get that rocket to the launch pad, and then the early struggles with Cargo Dragon. And then it goes through the failures, the big failures, CRS-7 in 2015 and Amos 6 in 2016. and how SpaceX struggled to come back to that, and ultimately reach a very high flight rate on the Falcon 9. And I go pretty deep into what it took to reuse the rocket and what the engineers had to do to make all of that work. So that's an important part of the story. And another big part, honestly, it's kind of crazy considering what's happening in the real world. But I spent a couple of chapters talking about the development of Crew Dragon and the competition with Boeing and the Starliner vehicle, and how, have a very long scene in the room where that contract decision was made in 2014, very pivotal moment, and ultimately it was decided that no, it would not just be Boeing that got a contract, but SpaceX would as well for Crew Dragon. And now, a decade later, SpaceX potentially could be rescuing the Starliner astronauts from the International Space Station. We don't know if that's going to play out yet, but it really sort of provides all of the background to that story. So the period is roughly 2008 to 2020 in terms of telling the story, and it's really from the perspective of not just Elon, but the engineers who worked for him and who did this and made this happen. And that's really what kind of the magic of the book is. You have all these colorful anecdotes from the people who struggled the hardest with these really difficult moments, and their failures and their successes.
Mm. And that seems to be what SpaceX is. It's a fantastic team. Would you say that over this period that you mentioned, 2008 2020, is it the technical difficulties that is the most significant that have overcome? We now take reusable rockets for granted, and
we do, yeah.
They've launched, I don't know, 100, I don't know, I haven't checked it, 100, 150 plus.
350.
Oh, there you go. You see, I'm 50% down. And we take it for granted. But how is that the sort of key takeaway from that period? Is the sort of technical and normalization of flying a rocket to space, landing it back on the launch pad, and reusing it over and over again?
Certainly, the technical part of it was extremely challenging and demanding, but I think there's a very human element to it as well. People who did this worked incredibly long hours and worked incredibly hard to make this happen. So it's people who believed in the vision and were willing to work hard enough to make it happen. And yes, the technical stuff is there, but also like lots of regulatory stuff, lots of working with the government, with NASA, with the Department of Defense, with the FAA, to get the permission to really change things that were so long ingrained in space. Like just to take one example, you have the idea of the autonomous flight termination system. So this is the bomb that goes on the rocket that someone can send a signal to explode it if the rocket goes off course. We've of course seen these in action with the recent Starship flights, where the automatic or the flight termination system, blows up. That was a huge leap for the U.S. Space Force or in the Air Force back when it was considered. People have been talking about doing that for decades. It's basically like where the computer on board makes that decision and senses a problem and ultimately decides to blow up the rocket. And so that took the human element out of that loop. And that was just, that was the kind of thing that enabled them to go so much faster. And so they had to do, and oh, by the way, like companies like United Launch Alliance still are doing like the traditional flight termination system, which takes a long time to set up and prepare for. And it adds complexity to the launch process. And so SpaceX has had to do a million things like that, technical, but also regulatory and procedurally, to get to the point where they can launch, 3 Falcons in a day and, launch 115 a year.
That's crazy. And we talk about the team behind SpaceX, and Gwynne Shotwell undeniably is one of the strongest parts of that team. How influential is she in the complexity of SpaceX? Because when you're dealing with people like NASA, I imagine she's a very credible, calm, collected, but also nice to work with Perhaps, I don't know. I haven't had any dealings with her, obviously. But compared to someone eccentric like Elon, I imagine she's sort of a safest pair of hands as you can get, really. But what do you think about her and what she's done for SpaceX over that period?
Well, she's certainly a velvet glove in her dealing with the government and other customers, but she's hard as steel underneath that. And she's pretty simpatico with Elon when it comes to policy at SpaceX and carrying out his demands. But you're right; she does give NASA and the Department of Defense a lot of confidence in SpaceX's activities and promises. And there's some pretty good anecdotes. But there's so she's super important. Like, you cannot underestimate her value. But there's also people like Mark Juncosa, who is Elon's fixer inside of the company for a lot of different things. And then I tell the stories of a bunch of other people, sort of not at that level, but who have played just absolutely key roles in making SpaceX a success over the last 15 years.
Absolutely. And I was just thinking about that period and sort of pivotal moments, and for me the first Falcon Heavy launch was a pivotal moment for SpaceX. And when was that? That was about
February 2018.
February 2018, exactly. So right bang in the middle. How significant was that in terms of awareness of SpaceX and their mission, do you think?
I think it was really important because it just, the visuals were so arresting of those two rockets landing side by side. I think it was, in some ways, in fact, I write this in the book, it was kind of the end of the first phase of SpaceX. Yeah. Because up until that point, there were so many people doubting what they could do and accomplish. And you had, with the Falcon Heavy, a private company with entirely their own money had built the world's most powerful rocket and just launched it first time, bang off success. And I mean, that's a huge achievement. But then you add sort of on the Starman element, right? Which Elon kept a secret even from his own company. And so I talked to the guy that actually had to refit the Tesla to make it spaceworthy. And then you had the booster landings, right? Which were on international news. I think really what Falcon Heavy meant to the company was that was right at the moment where they were starting. That it was an important period when they were starting to put a few more resources towards Starship, and they were just really kind of getting into the nitty gritty of designing that vehicle and building the first prototypes. Yeah, and I think it was critical because it helped those employees believe that anything was possible, even something as ultra ambitious as a fully reusable super heavy lift rocket, which Starship intends to be.
Yeah, you're right. It was such a audacious. I mean, because I'm a bit of a space fan, obviously, so I watch a lot of the launches. But I think that was one that all my friends started sending me links saying, "Did you see it?" And I was like, "Yes, of course I did. It was amazing." But it's hard not to feel emotional, especially when you add on the David Bowie Starman track. I just never seen anyone do it like that before, because it's I guess you could call it the sort of showmanship and the marketing of it. And actually the Tesla at the end, again, it just sort of added to it. Sort of cynics say, oh, he's promoting his car company, but it doesn't take long to understand that was just a replacement for a payload. And would I have felt emotional with a tingling spine if it was just a concrete block at the end? No, of course not. So there was a touch of magic there for sure.
It was a brilliant way to sort of connect to a lot of people back on Earth. Through seeing such a familiar sight as an automobile is obviously very eye-catching and irresistible, I think, for people covering the mission and for television, internet, all of that. And the brilliance of that is that it wasn't just marketing, right? This wasn't a PowerPoint slide. This wasn't a flashy promotional video. They actually launched the freaking rocket. They put the car in space and sent it on a Mars orbit trajectory, and they landed the boosters. Like, they did it all. And I mean, Like it's brilliant marketing, but it's brilliant marketing backed up by real world success and achievement. And so I think that's the magic. Is it's you can have 100 presentations about what the Artemis program is going to be, right? And NASA can do that till the cows come home, and you can have a great technical achievement with lousy production or marketing skills. But when you marry the two together, you get something incredibly special.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned Artemis, and I just want to sort of touch on it. Really, what's your thoughts about it? Because for me, I'm a fan, obviously, but I speak to people outside of the space bubble, the space choir, and you say, do you know about the Artemis missions? And you just get everyone just looks blankly. I don't know if that's a UK thing, but it seems to me there is a bit of a sort of a disconnect from it, and it hasn't yet reached the level of positivity and excitement that the Apollo era had. What are your thoughts about that, or do you think it's just a different world, and the world's changed since then?
Right. Well, they haven't flown people yet, so that's when the public will start paying attention, and so hopefully next year sometime we'll see. And bigger picture, my thoughts on the Artemis program is I think it's great. Like I've been covering space for a long time, Ben, and have been waiting for a credible human deep space exploration program to come back. I was born a few months after the final Apollo landing, so I never saw that. And I want to see humans get out there again. And this is the first time where everyone has been aligned in forever. You've got the White House, you've got Congress, you've got traditional space, you've got commercial space, you've got the international partners, like dozens of them, which is really awesome to see. And you've got the space community, which is generally excited about this. And so everyone is more or less pulling in the same direction. And that hasn't happened with the deep space program since Apollo. I do have concerns. Also, I think going back to the moon is absolutely the right step. And NASA has flip-flopped on that back and forth, but going to the lunar surface is absolutely what we should be doing. So there are some concerns, obviously. There are budget concerns, there are schedule concerns, there are complexity concerns. All of that is valid. But this is hard and it's going to take some time to work through, but I think we are overwhelmingly on the right course.
For sure. And it's certainly not limited to X amount of companies, pardon the pun, but it can be, there should be every government and state on Earth and every company could be trying to go to space. There's certainly not a scarcity there. Well, that's super interesting. And in terms of other companies, who else do you think is there? Obviously, there's a sort of Rocket Lab. I'm just trying to get your sort of overall feel on what's going on in the industry. Are there any other players that, just thinking about space exploration, that are going to be making movements in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, the main competition is China and their quasi-commercial space industry, which is copying what SpaceX is doing basically almost completely in terms of rockets and satellites and things like that. They're behind, but they're spending money and they'll catch up. They have a very vibrant industry, and the government is very, very interested in their space program. And so they've already done lots of interesting things with the Chang'e 6 lunar sample return from the far side of the moon, and just lots of interesting, aggressive, programs by China. And then the other company that I think in the near term is going to be most interesting is the Blue Origin appears to finally be waking up. They have a new CEO, Dave Limp. They are probably within 3 to 6 months of launching New Glenn for the first time, which is, I don't think people are really going to appreciate the scope of that rocket until they see it. It's gigantic. And it's going to be great to have 2 partially reusable heavy lift rockets, because that really does say, hey, the future is not expendable heavy lift, it's reusable heavy lift. And they're doing lots of other interesting things as well. They've got some pretty cool lunar missions planned. And so, for a long time, my attitude toward Blue Origin is like, they really need to show up and actually start delivering on all of these programs that they've been talking about forever. And the fact is they have, like the BE-4 engine that they delivered to United Launch Alliance appears to be a kick-ass engine. It worked super well on its first time out. And as I say, we're getting close to New Glenn, and they're making meaningful progress on lunar landers. So I'm excited to see what they have, because honestly, we need competition to SpaceX in the United States. It's SpaceX cannot and should not do it all. And so if you have a couple of really successful commercial companies, that just lifts the whole industry.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely the way forward. And it's hard because there's everyone always talks about the tortoise and the hare with Blue Origin, but it hasn't even been that much time. We're comparing everyone over a decade, which is nothing in the grand scale of humanity. And, I think it will definitely accelerate. Do you think there's a sort of first mover advantage where companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, the Chinese, once the first few companies are at scale and they're launching hundreds and thousands of rockets a year, the barrier for entry is going to be so high it's going to be more difficult? Or do you think the cost of, you'd be able to buy a rocket online and start your own, a bit like the airlines back in the day where, Branson was able to just sort of buy a 747 and change the branding and launch an airline. Do you think those companies will allow new players, or do you think it's going to be they've got in early, and the scale of economy of learning over time means that they're just going to corner the market, sort of as many companies as you can count on one hand?
Well, one thing I learned from reporting Reentry is that it's really, really, really super hard to build a reusable orbital rocket. Like the amount of stuff that those guys and gals had to go through to make that a success is really, you cannot help but be in awe of what they achieved in a relatively short period of time. I do think there's a huge first mover advantage for SpaceX and potentially for Blue Origin if they can get going. Just because the cost of it costs a couple $100 million to build a tiny orbital rocket. So something like Electron, Falcon 1, those kinds of boosters are still just require a lot of capital. So if you're going to go bigger, it's like billions of dollars. And it's really hard, I think, to raise money, especially if you have SpaceX and Blue Origin already out there doing it. How are you going to compete with those companies? And so, I really admire what Stoke Space is trying to do. They're bringing a new concept to reuse and pushing it really hard and aggressively. And so I'm excited to see what they do. But that being said, one of the lessons I think from Reentry is that sometimes David can rise up to become Goliath. This really is the story of how SpaceX was this pesky gnat back in 2008, and United Launch Alliance was this behemoth, right, launching all of the important things for the United States government, Department of Defense, and then 10 to 15 years later, it's completely reversed, right? Like ULA is desperately chasing to try to compete to catch back up with SpaceX, and there's one period from 2022 to 2023 where SpaceX launched 50 times between ULA launches. So it's like that relationship has completely been reversed. So I think the message is that yes, you could always have upstarts come along who do things better or faster or cheaper.
Well, it's a fascinating time to be alive, obviously, in respect to space. But hopefully it's something that can. I always talk about the overview effect in this podcast and how space could be the thing that unites us. But that goal of SpaceX of sending humans to Mars, how powerful is that vision? And do you get a sense that the however many 10,000 plus people that work for SpaceX, it's not just a pipe dream anymore? Do you think they truly believe it? And has it got to that stage where it's transcended just Elon Musk's vision, and now it's SpaceX's vision?
Well, it was always SpaceX's vision. That was why, no kidding, that's why he founded the company, and has stuck to that vision consistently for 2 decades, and tells new employees that is the vision, and he's serious about it. I don't know if there's any question about that in my mind. I think what I think is special about that is that for decades after Apollo, the space enthusiast community and I would count myself among them, always understood that humans settling the solar system was part of our destiny, right?
Yeah.
That was really, as Star Trek said, the final frontier and where we belonged out there. But NASA wasn't going to undertake that mission. Governments weren't going to undertake that mission. And so Elon comes along and he has that vision that we all have, but then he actually goes out and starts building this stuff to try to make that happen. And so I think that's what's special about him. And that, yes, the vision today is still fantastical. It's still science fiction, but slowly, day by day, they are making that fiction into reality. And it's happening before our eyes. So I would agree with you, Ben, that this is a fantastic time to be alive if you're interested in space, because there's just so much interesting and dynamic things happening at SpaceX, but also at NASA and many, many other places and companies.
Mm. Well, it's a fantastic book. You were kind enough to send me a copy, and I'll certainly link it in the show notes so people can catch it. And it's quite recent as well, because even the epilogue that you mentioned, you sort of talked about how it sort of struck with me how in 2016 where he was where Elon was saying the main reason he's accumulating assets is to fund his Mars mission, and you voiced concerns about how his potential distractions of buying X could be detrimental to SpaceX and their mission. So I was just kind of interested what your thoughts on that now was, really. It's hard to talk about Elon and not mention things like X. Do you think there's going to be a time where that communication tool, call it a tool, is going to be instrumental in inspiring humanity, that Mars is the answer?
I think as Elon wades more and more into politics, which, hey, he can do whatever he wants. It's his company, it's his reputation, it's his life, and he's entitled to live it however he wants. But I do think that becoming so strongly associated with one political party in the United States does harm his brand and the brands of Tesla and SpaceX and his other companies. It just is going to turn some people off who you would like to have along for the ride. And so, the way I kind of think about it is Elon for 20 years has been this positively disruptive force at SpaceX and in the space industry. And my concern is that instead of a disruptive force, he becomes a distraction to what SpaceX is trying to accomplish. And so I hope that doesn't happen, but I'm concerned that it might.
Mm. It's so interesting. And then, so talking about your book, it brings the story of SpaceX up until 2020. What you're about? I think you're about Elon Musk's age, aren't you? Early 50s.
Just a year younger, yeah.
Yeah. So you're sort of at a similar life path, and I'm sure there's another book or books in the works. But I'll be fascinated to read it and see what stories unfold. What do you think is going to be the story of Elon Musk and SpaceX? Do you think he's going to get us to Mars? Do you think he's going to die on Mars?
I don't think he'll die on Mars. I would be surprised if he ever went to Mars. And I don't know. The answer to your question is I don't know where the story is going. I'm hopeful that the vision comes to fruition. And I think that truly, if Starship does become a fully reusable super heavy lift rocket, at some point it won't matter as much what Elon does, because will be just such a transformative vehicle for how humanity's relationship with outer space. That it's honestly, Ben, I go back to 2021, that when NASA chose SpaceX as the sole provider for the human landing system for the Artemis program. That was just a huge bet. And I think that's such a pivotal moment in spaceflight history, because NASA was saying, okay, we believe in a future in which rockets are reusable and which there's in-space refueling and distributed launch, all of these things that the agency had not been on board with for decades. And all of a sudden, they were putting their most important program, that they were putting Starship in the line of it had to work, right? It was on the critical path. And since then, we've seen Blue Origin come out with this similar architecture for a lunar lander with multiple launches of New Glenn, reusable spacecraft going between Earth and the Moon, and reusable spacecraft going down to the lunar surface and back. Like, that is the future we are now on, and it's an exciting future. SpaceX's success will greatly accelerate that future and realize Musk's ambitions. But as I point out in Reentry, there's certainly some risk that the train could come off the tracks.
Fantastic. Well, I'll link the how to buy the book in the show notes, and it's been great to chat. And I'll follow your story as well. And what an exciting time! Let's good luck for the Polaris Dawn missions and Starliner and New Glenn and everything else. And keep covering it, because you've got a fantastic way of telling stories, and I really appreciate what you do.
Well, thank you, Ben. Thanks for the time to come on and talk about these things.